And I just want to welcome everyone this morning to the final series, or the final webinar in the Drainage and Doughnuts webinar series. And just so everyone knows, if you attended all 5 webinars, you'll be receiving a gift card, kind of a email gift card to enjoy a donut on our team. And we want to thank everybody for joining the webinar series over the last couple of weeks. It's been really great, and we've had some great questions and conversations and heard from speakers all around the country. And I know I've learned a lot. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers this morning. Today we have Ryan Patch with us, and it sounds like Laura DiPietro as well from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. And we wanted to wrap up the series talking about some proposed changes to the required agricultural practices in Vermont that will basically have some new requirements for installing and managing fields that have subsurface tile drainage. So Ryan and Laura are going to give us an update on that, and we'll have some time for questions from them. And then at the end of the webinar, hopefully, if my internet connection holds out, I'm going to talk a little bit about the survey results from our tile drainage survey that we conducted last fall. Some very interesting results. So hopefully we have time for that. So with that though, Ryan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks. Morning, everybody. It's Ryan Patch here with Laura DiPietro, and thanks for the opportunity to come and share an update on the required agricultural practices. As many folks may know, we've been working on this since Act 64 of 2015 was passed in 2015. We've developed a series of legislative reports, worked with a group of stakeholders and researchers and others to better try to understand the extent and interface of ag subsurface tile drainage with nutrient losses from croplands. And as the agency which implements the non-point source rules for agriculture, we were charged in Act 64 with revising the required agricultural practices, which are non-point source rules for farms in the state of Vermont.
So the Agency of Ag was charged to revise the RAPs to include subsurface tile drainage. So taking all of the data and information in various meetings we had, we did our best to try and meet with the farm groups that have organized themselves around water quality topics, as well as the other groups that Ryan had mentioned. And so we came up with a draft, and we went out with that draft, and we then did another series of comments and made some edits to that draft. That first draft goes to what they call ICAR, which is interagency check, to make sure that we didn't step on anybody else's toes within state government and in the laws that exist. And then the final step, which we just recently completed, is LCAR, the legislative committee, to make sure that we met the legislative intent. And so this slide here you can see is our charge was January 15th, 2018 to put that all together. So we had submitted the first draft by that date, and it has gone through several iterations again until we got to today, which today we hope to actually file that rule.
Great. So we put together this list of activities that state and partners have undertaken since Act 64 of 2015 to better do research and understand what is the extent of tile drainage in the state of Vermont, and what are some of the potential outfalls and impacts from tile drain. The basin program literature review that was put together looking at tile drain and the ability for phosphorus to be lost, as well as other nutrients from tiles to water. So that was an important group which came out with a report outlining a few steps forward. A few of those recommendations made them into the final rule, which we'll get to. The Agency of Ag has been working with partners from the conservation districts, the ACD and UVM Extension, to do tile drain sampling and analysis on 42 sites throughout the state of Vermont. So that's an important body of work to try to get a sense of what are the different, what's actually coming out of tile drains in Vermont. DEC commissioned literature review looking at tile drain mapping. We also, like Champlain Steering Committee, they're looking at tile drainage and other studies that are happening there. Stone Environmental has a water quality monitoring project in the Jewett Brook watershed, and they're getting some interesting results out of there. And further, and we'll touch on this at the end of the presentation, but this is a new amendment to the RAPs. The RAP amendment in 2016 actually already put forward requirements for certified small farm operators, large farms, and medium farms as far as utilizing the phosphorus index, new 6.0, 6.1 phosphorus index, which now requires planning for nutrient management on fields that have systematic pattern tile drainage on it.
So to get to where we got today, we had 3 public meetings, we had a public comment period, and all that was in the spring. And then we revised this. This is just that public front. We also had a ton of just stakeholder meetings where we went and met privately with groups. One thing I do want to share for this slide is the process going through LCAR and the miscommunication that I do feel the legislature took from all the documentation that was provided to them. So the Agency of Ag wrote, we had to do an interim tile report and a final tile report. And then DEC did that mapping report. And one of the things that is a real challenge is mapping these tile drains. And the discussion and piece that the Agency of Ag laid out was that the regulatory framework for requiring nutrient management plans is already there. Part of that is in your phosphorus index, identifying that a field is systematically tile drained and planning for that drainage. There's also a requirement for some of the farms, and we have been asking farms to submit what we call shape files. So if you're familiar with the Farm Service Agency map, it's the yellow line of the field. And so what we've been trying to take the yellow field lines and the P-index values that show that there are fields that have subsurface tile drain in them and overlap the two to create a map. And that is something, we've got data on that, but certainly we need to get better data on that and consistent data throughout the years into the future. The Agency of Ag, I think literally beat up might be the phrase we could use for not coming and showing that we have required that everyone map all of their tile drains in all of their fields. And we did try and explain the challenge of doing this. There's different ages of tiles. Not everybody installed the tiles themselves. The newer technology certainly has the ability to GPS where the tiles are laid, but there are challenges with that. And so we had not made that a requirement of the RAPs because inherently we ought to be able to get a good amount of data from the nutrient management plans. With that said, though, farmers do need to respond to that, and our letters where we ask for shape files and we also ask for the P-index data. If we don't have that data, I do not have any sense to believe that otherwise we won't be required to have a higher level of intensive mapping coming at us in the near future. So I think what you do there is actually great, it's efficient, and we just need to make sure that we get the data. So just a plug for that and a plug for the partners, FSA specifically, who's helped us help farmers get a lot of these shape files. And just on a front, this is an area where we are moving forward with enforcement actions when people are not doing the request to give the data. So if you start to hear as a partner or you are a farmer and you receive one of these, that is why. We just need to satisfy this understanding of being able to quantify where there is tile drainage on an aggregate scale. So, and then like I mentioned earlier, if you didn't hear that, today we hope to go and file the rule. So we will, over this winter, host a few more meetings. This is great to have this webinar opportunity, but we've obviously got to go share this information about this new rule to folks at this point over the winter. So that'll be a plan. We'll be hosting meetings throughout the state.
Absolutely. So we're going to take a quick dive into the RAPs as they were approved by LCAR. The first thing with whenever you're talking about an item that's going to be, regulated or, required to have management around it, you want to make sure folks know what you're talking about. So we start with the definition. In the rule, as you can see here, it is, subsurface tile drainage means a conduit installed in cropland beneath the ground surface to collect and/or convey water to an outlet. And this is inclusive of both, dendritic single tile lines in a field, whether it's corrugated plastic or old clay lines, or, more modern intensive system pattern tile drainage. There are different requirements for different intensities of, tile drain installation, which we'll speak about in a moment. But this tile rule applies generally to all types of tile in agricultural cropland. The first new portion of the RAPs is embedded in the manure stacking setback requirements, which are in the main part of the rules. Those that have been following this rule will notice that it's not all under Section 12. We've actually taken the respective portions of the proposed rule, and in the final filing, based on comments we received from farmers and others that it was confusing when it was redundant and not clear, we went and put the requirements back within the existing rule. So if you know Section 602E, as I know everyone does, manure needs to meet these sort of requirements, and you can't site it within 100 feet of a subsurface tile drain. So for system pattern tile drains, that's going to be pretty tough in Vermont. I think that you can be able to stack manure on some of those fields. If you have a wet sag that you tiled a long time ago, that manure stacking requirement is going to apply. There is a variance request process that is part of 602F. So if there's no other options and their environment is adequately protected, there are opportunities for farmers to apply for a variance for this manure stacking setback.
So the other piece here that changed in the current RAPs, I'm sorry, I can't say, well, I can say current for one more day. That when you have higher level soil test phosphorus, to be more mindful of how and when nutrients are applied and what rate. And when you have pattern tile drainage, when you looked at the literature review, there's this potential that there could be a threshold in phosphorus, and the threshold is not defined. It was an area of research that was definitely identified that could be done. But certainly using UVM crop recommendations saying 20 parts per million is excessive for crop needs. If it's not able to be taken up, it obviously could increase the risk that it could be lost through a tile drain system. So when you have that, we're saying you need to apply at less than that crop removal rate so that you are balancing and drawing from the soil adequately. Another thing to keep in mind, and Heather, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe UVM has changed. You no longer see the residual phosphorus that's in your soil. You only see the available phosphorus in your soil on your soil test. So even though you might see 20 parts per million, you could have a lot more phosphorus that's in your soil that's just more bound and not available for the plant. And it can become available. So that is something we're trying to draw on some of those resources that are in the soil in addition to those that are available. So this is a little bit different, meaning it is a less than standard versus just apply at crop removal rates, which is the standard for non-pattern tile drains fields.
Gives a bit more sideboards around what a drawdown strategy should look like on those excessive soil test phosphorus fields, was the intent here. So now we're into Section 12, which is now the subsurface tile drainage section of the RAPs. So we did create a new section for tile drains, in addition to those that were embedded within existing parts of the rule. And this says for all farming operations with any type of subsurface tile drainage, unless the secretary approves something different, you should not site concentrating feeding areas above subsurface tile drainage. So in pasture areas, making sure the bale ring, when it turns to an area that's unimproved and turns into a barnyard or feedlot where there's significant, where there's no vegetation and they're sustained by supplemental feed, making sure those feed bale rings, etc., wherever the cows are being fed are not sited over tile. Drainage is one of the requirements. And then the other portion here is for a less common treatment practice, but it is used in Vermont, is the vegetated treatment areas that are used for treating generally milk house waste from some dairies. But these are siting requirements for engineers that are working on developing these sorts of waste treatment practices, but making sure new vegetated treatment areas that go in are at least 200 feet away, an upslope from subsurface tile drains, and that new tile drains are not installed within 200 feet downslope of existing vegetated treatment areas. So those that are already in place are grandfathered, unless it's in place and you're going to install tile, in which case stay at least 200 feet downslope, as we want to make sure that soils are filtering as much as possible, and there's as much time as the system's designed to make sure nutrients are taken away from adequately utilized in those vegetated treatment areas.
So one thing too, so a vegetated treatment area also includes some of this older silage leachate treatment systems where they were constructed wetland type systems.
Yep.
But there was a lot of feedback that the agency received during the LCAR process on if we're saying, because one of the arguments for why we couldn't possibly get consistent mapping throughout the state is that farmers do not know where all their tile drains might be. We were then pressed to say, well, if they don't know where they are, how can they comply with these siting requirements for field stacks, for these unimproved feedlot barnyards and new vegetated treatment areas? And our description was that when you're actually constructing and building one of these practices, you do a site assessment. And so there is this opportunity to take a look, a more deeper look at the tools. And so if you're a partner or a farmer working on developing one of these projects, just being mindful of the tools, some of the things that the Agency of Ag uses, aerial imagery really can help a lot. And certainly looking at different years of aerial imagery, you can see the wetness and dryness and get a sense of whether there's tile there. Obviously walking along any ditches or outlet areas where a drain might fall. But also keeping in mind too, some of these, like this slide in particular, these are things that are typically near a production area. And there is drain systems in production area, but not necessarily always perforated drain systems, right? So a roof may have a downspout that might be hardline piped out to a ditch. That is very different than what we're talking about here in terms of subsurface tile drainage.
So the last, well, no, not the last, but the last component of section 12.1 is what the committee members term the rule, the mousetrap rule. It is the requirement that new or modified subsurface tile drainage, whether systematic or dendritic, installed or modified after January 1st, 2019, need to make sure they have a rodent guard installed at the outlet of the drain system. And what you can see on the right is, an example of what that could look like. There are a lot of different models out there. But on the left, what you can see is what some rodents can do, getting up in a tile line and chewing through that and creating very large macropores, which can cause the system to fail and cause a significant amount of soil nutrients to come out those tile lines and maybe even, disrupt and break the tile system. So we understand it's common industry practice to install rodent guards and just make sure that practice continues.
And so keep in mind, this is only on new and modified systems. This requirement does not apply to, like, there's a photo here of a clay pipe, but it does not apply to those older systems unless you modify that system.
Great point. That changed based on the proposed rule, based on comments from farms.
So surface inlets is a separate issue and was treated that way. These inlets, the surface inlets, are perforated. They are meant to drain water into them. If you have a pipe that is hard lined, so it's not perforated, that is not a surface inlet as long as water cannot flow into it. So if you do have some of these and you can modify them, that is a good choice if you can create a space where there is no perforation going down, if it's just truly like a clean out as an example. But mostly these are used as sort of the ability to move water from the surface down through the pipe and quickly drain areas, sometimes like a concave area in a field. So what we said is going forward, once the date of this passes, which will be this week, no more of these can be installed. And that was based on a lot of conversation with folks who install tile, saying that if you do the land shaping appropriately up front, you won't need these. So again, you can still have a clean out if it's hard lined, if that's truly what you need in your system, but having an actual surface inlet meant for water drainage is not going to be allowed going forward. Currently, the RAPs that were passed in 2016 already established having 25-foot buffers around these where you can't spread manure. And that's because essentially they act similar to a surface water, right? They are a conduit, and once something gets into these, they are going to be able to get to the outlet. And so we require 25-foot buffers on all of these if they exist in the field. One thing, we had a lot of discussion. There are definitely diversions that were created in the system years ago with NRCS or just AOT. I've seen some things. We're not talking about a true diversion. We are talking about something that drains an agricultural field for the purpose of solely that, not something that is meant to divert water from coming into an agricultural field prior to it getting there and then being diverted around it.
And again, another exemption is written to this part of the rule for the Secretary of Agriculture to approve drainage control structures that are needed to protect infrastructure, divert clean water. Generally that may or may not tie into a tile drain system, but there are, of course, unique situations that rise up all the time, and there is the ability for a exemption or variance to be granted by the Secretary.
So when we originally wrote the first draft of this, as Ryan had mentioned, we duplicated a lot of things that were already in the 2016 RAPs. And these are some of those items. So just stating again that a 590 nutrient management plan is required on all certified medium and large farms. Within that, there's that P-index piece that we just covered. And there's also getting soil to T, which was a change for all the small farms when we did that revision in 2016. They were previously at 2T. And so making sure that there's good soil health, which obviously gives the opportunity for the soil to manage any water or nutrients that are within it. But there was also the pieces about, if you over apply manure and therefore it ceases to be beneficial or useful, then it could be a violation in the current RAPs. And the other piece was when you have times when it's likely and someone, anyone can look at the situation and say, if you were to apply manure on this state, yes, it was probably going to run off. Those pieces are already in there, and it applies to this tile drainage as well. Because what we really looked at was, in all the research, the real challenge with tile drainage is not necessarily the drainage. It is the source of nutrients when we talk about water quality. And so the sources of nutrients on a farm are typically either what's already in the soil or what is applied to the soil. And so making sure that nutrient management is utilized and done well and is thoughtful as far as conditions of the field is the best way to reduce and manage the risk on that field.
And this is going to be, one of the real focuses of the outreach that the agency engages in this winter is making sure folks are aware of those facts that, good fundamental nutrient management and, control of the source when it's applied to a field are, the best tools for minimizing losses from tile drain. So there's nutrient management requirements for all size farms, and those that are CSFO, certified small farm and larger, there's the 590 standard. And so making sure those plans are developed and implemented is a really important component of managing potential nutrient losses.
And making sure you keep your records and working with the staff that might work on your farm that do this land application, that they are aware of all of these challenges and setbacks and do keep records timely, because we are asking for records on inspections and we are enforcing when records are not present, because it is really important for this. If there were an issue and something did go through a tile and it were obvious because Irene comes through, right? You doing and showing as a farmer that you've done everything correctly is really important when we get a complaint and we go out there to the field.
We've already touched on this piece, so let's run right through it. But the new phosphorus index has a new calculation for subsurface particulate and dissolved losses. So making sure those of that size are utilizing that phosphorus index and is implemented as one of the planning criteria is an important component.
So just to note, last year, this planning criteria was relatively new, and understanding the release of it and the time frame of when regulatory plans are due to the Agency of Agriculture. This coming year, large farms are due it in February, and medium farms are due in April. We need to see this year. Again, intense pressure from the legislature on mapping and using this stuff. And so please create these phosphorus index. Make sure if you have a planner or if you're going through and doing it yourself that you're doing the new phosphorus index that has the tile drainage component in it.
Laura already touched on this in the overview. Section 605H, there's a requirement there to make sure that nutrients are applied according to a nutrient management plan, and you don't over-apply such that it ceases to be useful or beneficial. The literature is pretty clear that when you're over-applying an exceedance of crop removal or what's necessary, you can have significant losses to tile drains. And this is going to be, another big component of education is, in section 605D, there's a requirement there to look at field conditions when applying nutrients. We've spent a lot of time talking about flooding, flooding, runoff, and ponding. When can I spread when fields are wet, or if it's about to rain, or if it's a light drizzle? Those are all conversations we've had. Now that the tile drain rule is in effect, making sure we're adding the other off-site movement component to those conversations to make sure folks are aware of field conditions on a tile drain, system pattern tile drain field in particular, when it is too dry and you have soil cracking as evident, shown in the lower right photo in the lower right-hand corner. Those can connect directly to tile drains, and the surface application of manure that's not incorporated can lead to, or even if it is incorporated sometimes, it can lead to pretty decent, it can lead to losses through those macro pores. So, and also, timing with storm events, if you do see those cracks in fields, it's really important that farmers are aware of soil conditions, both too wet and too dry when applying nutrients.
So we mentioned soil health, that piece is in here, just making sure that any gullies that you might have obviously is a challenge, but all of that soil health really retains the volume of water, the nutrients, allows crop growth to be successful. Again, if you have a low yield, then the nutrients you applied based on a higher yield are there in that soil. And if there's subsurface tile drainage, those nutrients are retained in that soil and could be lost through this flow down through the macropores in the off season, during this season. So it's really important to have good soil health practices and maintain yields that are consistent with the manure applications that you're planning for. So some of the work that we, when we start rolling this out, this will obviously be a lot of work over this field season to talk about tile drainage, but the TSPs, they've all been trained, the technical service providers, on using the new phosphorus index tool. So that's a really important part that we want to do. But we also want to make sure, as we're working with folks like UVM Extension, who's helped us with the custom manure applicator training and some of the farming training curriculum that's done there as well through districts and other partners, that you're incorporating some of this tile drainage information into those. And I think a lot of that also comes, Heather, you mentioned you'll do the survey results in a minute, but we are also collecting all this data from 42 sites with this partnership and talking more and more about how that data is looking over time. In this particular year, the data looks relatively good. It was a relatively dry year as well. So it's going to take several years of data collection to really understand sort of the body of information. Going back to the research discussions that have been had in the past, is tile drainage better or worse for overall losses from the field over a course of a year? And research that's coming out of Minor Institute and out of Quebec has shown that tile drainage can overall be better for the field for nutrient losses. So we will continue down that path to look at as much data and information we can to try and answer that question here in Vermont. but also keeping in mind if the source is the only pathway, right? If there is very little source or very well managed source, then the likelihood of a loss would be reduced. So reach out to us, reach out to the partners if you need anything. And again, we are very much taking this seriously on record keeping and getting data to us so that we can generate these maps. Our intent with the maps is to create an aggregate map that would be released. The data, as the large farms have to submit the data every year to us, the medium farms and certified small farms, we've been requesting farms to submit that data, and that is under one of our abilities to gather and develop information so that we can create an aggregate map. So that wraps it up. The website there has a lot of information available on it. And hopefully we did a good job getting this right. We tried to do our best to use the data that's available. One of the challenges is, we live in the world where when you create a regulation, it applies very broadly, and you've got to be really mindful of the impacts of that. And so we tried to do our best balancing, understanding what science we had available to us that was confident. One of the problems with the literature in tile drainage is you can have an opinion if you want, and then you can find the literature to back up that opinion. And so those areas we tried to stay away from, where there's ambiguity in whether it's the right choice or the wrong choice. And we really tried to stick to, again, thinking about source and management there, and really focusing on nutrient management in particular. And then just obvious things like don't pile areas where you're concentrating waste near a tile. So those vegetative treatment areas, field stacks, and barnyards, keeping those away. So again, reducing source. And then the rodent guards was just an opportunity to make sure that we created less macropores, because macropores are a known area where if you do have a source and you do have a macropore, you have an increased risk. So managing that. And certainly, the clay soils in some areas of the state will be a challenge. We'll be interested to work with farmers to understand what tools they are trying to use to reduce impacts. We definitely have some of these study sites down in that area, and this year was a dry year, so just curious to see and discuss how some of the results are coming out as far as the field management aspect. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks. That was very informative. I think everybody knows the drill. If you have questions for Laura and Ryan, please type those in the chat box or the Q&A box. We have one question here for you folks. Does the new P index account for higher yields associated with pattern tile drained fields? It's kind of a maybe a question. Yeah.
Record keeping is important to document not just what nutrients are applied on the field, but tonnage reports from feed, from the silage or corn that's harvested from the field. They do say there's a 5 to 20% increase based on different soil conditions in general from system pattern tile draining a field. So a farmer would just need to document what their yields are, and then plan to that using the whatever appropriate standard, 590 if they're a large, medium, or certified small farm. So certainly can be planned for. Record keeping is an important component of that.
Great.
Yeah, just using book value across the board is where, unfortunately that gets into a little trouble where you start over planning yield. So that's why using your records and keeping data year after year to help build an average is really important.
All right. So type in your questions if you have any for Laura and Ryan. And I think what I'm going to do is show some of the survey slides and talk about that a little bit before our meeting ends. So if you have other questions for the two of them, they also provided their contact information here, or Ryan, to contact Ryan. And, please do. They're always willing to answer questions. And I'm just going to, share my screen here if I can. So last winter, I don't know. Oh, yes, I can. Do you want to continue? Yes. We conducted a survey. One of the things that we were interested in most specifically, because hear a lot that maybe tile drainage is not a conservation practice or a water quality practice, that it's maybe more detrimental to the environment than helpful. We were interested in kind of answering that question. You know, have there been changes in farmers' conservation practices as a result of implementing tile? So we conducted this survey last winter. The survey was approved through the IRB board at UVM, which for those folks that know what that means, it just means it's an official survey that meets all requirements for conducting a survey. And then we implemented that survey over the winter time. It's actually still open. We haven't closed it yet, but I'm going to share a few of the results so far that we've compiled. But first, I'm going to start just briefly. Laura already mentioned that she's the Agency of Agriculture is working with a number of partners, including UVM, to sample tiles, water coming out of tiles, and also looking at the flow. And we've been doing that as well. We have 5 farms participating in the sampling program, and we're measuring two outlets on each farm. And we're looking at total phosphorus, dissolved phosphorus, and total nitrogen as well. The samples are taken every 2 weeks. We go out to take samples, whether the tiles are running or not, so that we can record when the tiles are running. So right now we've looked at 95 different sampling events, and we've seen 95, we've been able to sample 95 times, but we've been out there 160 times. So if that shows you anything about how much the tiles are running. So here are our sample locations. You can see they're in Grand Island, Franklin County. So one of the things we're always interested in, and everyone else too, is how much are the tiles flowing. We've been actually doing a similar project for the last 2 years. So you can see this year, certainly it was a very dry year, as Laura alluded to, and you can see that the tiles were actually dry so far 41% of the time. They were only flowing 60% of the time that we went out. So 40% of the time there was no water coming out of the tiles. 2017 actually was a really wet year, and the tiles flowed, you know, closer to 75% of the time, but they still, you know, roughly about 25% of the time they were not flowing at all. And then in 2016, we saw similar results. So this was definitely a very dry year, and the tiles were not flowing as often as normal. And this is just a very quick snapshot of what we've seen. So this is all the 10 tile outlets averaged across the months where we've been sampling. And this only shows dissolved phosphorus. And you can just see, you know, the levels seem to be very low, or were low this year. This does not include flow data at all. So it doesn't give us all that much information, just to see that basically the levels were pretty low. And then as we started maybe to see more rain, you know, the levels started to go up. And, you know, these are different farms, different management. We do have, you know, some farms where levels, you know, tend to be higher. And we're trying to figure out, as I've mentioned in other presentations, why some farms have higher levels than others. And so we're looking at soil test data, manure application timing, and, you know, kind of all the practices Laura had already mentioned in their nutrient management plan to figure out why we see spikes once in a while. But I will say we don't see them all the time. You know, you might see them once in a sampling period, or in a whole sampling year, or in some cases on some farms, we never see it spike. So, you know, just trying to really understand what kind of management might lead to more losses than other. And we've had great speakers over the webinar series talking about the same thing. And so now we're trying to put those pieces really together to help farmers manage fields for, you know, this particular loss. You know, we're constantly managing, trying to reduce losses, especially surface losses, but now we have a real strong focus on also managing to make sure we minimize what comes out of the tile outlets. So you'll be seeing more about what's going on with these sampling studies, you know, as time goes on, like Laura mentioned. So let's go back to the survey quickly. Is tile drainage a conservation practice? So we wrote a survey with a bunch of people. It was reviewed by our Tile Drainage Advisory Committee, actually, our technical committee that the Agency of Agriculture put together. There were 18 multiple choice questions. And as I said, the survey was conducted last winter, and it's still available. So if you're a farmer in Vermont and you have not taken the survey yet, please do. So we had 153 respondents to the survey, and 74% of the respondents had some of their agricultural acres in tile drainage. So the remainder of the respondents responded they didn't have any. And of the respondents, 27% of all the land that we looked at had some type of tile drainage. So there were roughly 60,000 acres that responded to the survey, and 15,894 of those had some type of subsurface tile drainage. So one of the things that I felt was really interesting was that every farming type was using tile. So, and every scale of farm. So we had one farm that had only a half an acre of intensive vegetable production, and they responded to the survey, and their half acre was tile drained. So of the total acres, so like I said, there's about 60,000 acres that responded to the survey. 27% of those acres had tile drainage, but the majority of the acres were not. Field crops, of the field crop acres that responded, 39% of those had tile drainage. Hay only farmers or pasture farmers, so they didn't have row crops, 16% of those hay fields or pasture were tile drained. And perennial crops, 16%, and vegetables and fruit, 82% of the people that were growing fruits and vegetables of their acres were tiled. So I think the important point is that, you know, tile is used by very, very small farms and very large farms. They're, you know, it's implemented by vegetable and fruit producers, apple growers, hop growers, people that have pasture and are pasturing animals or just haying, and people that have field crops and dairy farms. So it's an important practice to many producers. One of the things we were really interested in was how this was impacting crop yields. And so we asked a bunch of questions about that. Here's just a couple of slides. So you can see the number of years out of 5 that farmers felt like they experienced depressed yields. This was before they tile drained. So you can see that basically 34% of the time before the farmer tiled their field, they felt like they had depressed yields. And basically, you know, over 60% of the respondents said that, you know, 4 out of 5 years they had depressed yields. So, you know, that's quite significant if you're trying to, you know, make a living off of the land. If you're not able to produce enough yield of whatever you're growing, it makes it really hard to make a living. So before implementing tile, the majority of the farms were experiencing depressed yields, you know, 3, 4, or 5 years. Okay, so then, you know, the other question we asked was about crop failures. I don't show that data, but that was also pretty astounding how many years out of 5 people would actually have complete crop failures. And, you know, the number was quite high, actually, which is a little bit scary. If you had a crop failure, you know, as a farmer, more than 3 years out of 5, you know, it's pretty tough to justify farming. You would hope that you don't see any crop failures out of 5 years. And even though that data is not here, I'll share with you that 23% of the farmers said that they had complete crop failures 3 out of 5 years. And if you look at, 3, 4, or 5 years and you put those numbers together, basically 35% of those farms were experiencing complete crop failure 3, 4, or 5 years. So that makes it really difficult to farm. And then you can see also that, farmers are implementing practices in less than ideal conditions. And when we say less than ideal conditions, we're essentially saying, is the soil, should you not be on the soil? Should you not be working the soil? Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'll just go through a few more of these slides. Why do fields not have tile drainage? So of the people that responded, 57% of the respondents said that they really, their fields may not be tiled now, but they're planning to, they want to. But the reason that they're not is mostly because of expense. So it's quite expensive and people are, trying to save money or waiting until they can afford to put the tile in. Okay, so back to our original question, adoption of conservation practices before and after subsurface tile drainage. So you can see before tile drainage, 20% of the respondents were using no-till. After the fields were tiled, 60% of the respondents were able to implement no-till. So there was a 37% increase in the number of acres under no-till. A very similar trend for cover crops. Before tile drainage, 50% of the folks were cover cropping. After tile drainage, that number went up to 80%. So that's quite a substantial increase that they were relating to the fact that they installed tile. And some other really interesting, and this mostly came from vegetable producers and our specialty crop producers, they were saying that they actually were able to reduce the amount of pesticides that they were using, which is an important piece that we don't think about. And I was actually surprised to see that number so high. So clearly people were able to implement more conservation practices after tile draining. And then, of course, people said, once I installed tile, I was able to implement field practices more timely in better conditions. So that was just across the board. Okay. And then we asked people about best management practices that they were using in their fields. And you can see respondents were saying they were using practices that will be required. So they're using split nutrient applications or spreading setbacks from the inlets, the rodent guards, so on and so forth. So people are implementing best management practices in those fields. And then I thought this was really interesting. The majority of the people felt that tile drainage did not pose an environmental risk. They strongly agreed that it did not pose a risk. And, I think we were trying to interpret this a bit. And of course, these are farmers that have implemented tile for various reasons. But what it led me to believe was that people felt that they were managing their fields to reduce risk, even though there was tile. But on the other hand, what I also thought was interesting was that over half of the participants felt like they needed more education on best management practices. So there's a real opportunity here to continue, these webinar series. We've developed fact sheets, and we keep talking about management at meetings and outreach events. So people want to get more education so that they don't pose a risk. Okay. And as you might have expected, 90% of the respondents felt that the tile drainage was important to their financial viability. So 59% of the people felt that it was extremely important, and 30% felt that it was really important, and that's why they did it. All right. So I'm just going to end on that because we are running out of time, but I wanted to share that. We will be posting that a summary and sharing that this winter. So I'm sorry we're out of time here. I want to get the chat box up. I don't see any other, okay, any other major questions here that I can't answer offline, but it says what kinds of data on runoff is needed prior to a new tile drainage installation? If you have naturally high levels of phosphorus before any applications, how do the regs allow a farmer to show that a new drainage plan is not the source of the excess phosphorus? I don't know, Ryan, if you're still on there and you can see that, but I think we can probably answer that offline. Are you still there?
Yep, we're still here. Yeah, we can follow up on that question offline as well.
Okay. All right. So, and there's some other questions about why the increase in August and September manure spreading weather. So why were the phosphorus levels going up in August and September? And I think, you know, again, we have to dig into the data. These are just summary points, but likely it could have been a change in the weather. We were seeing more rain events at that time. And, you know, there wasn't any more manure spread in August or September than any other months at that point, but that certainly could have been an issue. We have to go back and look. So I want to thank everybody for joining the webinar series, and I'm sorry we had some technical difficulties today and weren't able to keep on time like we normally do. If you have any feedback that you want to provide to us, that is great. We appreciate that. I am going to launch our quick poll for today. So if you're still on, please take a minute to answer those questions. Again, we use these quick polls to make sure that the information we're providing is useful and relevant. And again, the tile drainage conversation is not ending. It's just, you know, continuing, and the research, outreach, and education will continue as, you know, as long as we need to. And we appreciate everybody attending. So thank you very much. Laura and Ryan, anything you want to add before we close out for the day?
No, and thank you for sharing this survey data. That was great to see.
Yeah, and like I said, it's just a snapshot. We're putting together, you know, a final report that's obviously more comprehensive about the soil types and practices and so on and so forth. So it'll be great to share that with everyone. So if you haven't taken the survey, hey, please go on and do it before we make that final summary. All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much. Looks like everybody answered the quick poll. And we'll see you this winter, hopefully, at some meetings. Thanks. Have a good day.